This is Strides to Solutions. I am your host, Esther Adams. There's a category of behavior that shows up constantly in clinical work and in ordinary life, and it does not fit the story most people tell themselves about why habits form. The usual story goes that people repeat behaviors because those behaviors feel good, because something rewarding happens and the brain wants more of it. But a huge amount of repeated, deeply entrenched behavior does not actually feel good at all. Checking a lock 5 times does not feel pleasant. Worrying compulsively about something that has not happened yet does not feel pleasant. Reaching for a substance during withdrawal or scrolling a phone during a wave of anxious restlessness rarely produces anything resembling joy. What these behaviors have in common is not that they generate pleasure. It is that they make an unpleasant state stop, or at least feel like it has stopped. A behavior does not have to feel good to become powerful. It only has to make distress go away, even briefly. And understanding exactly how that works reveals a distinction that turns out to be more important than the usual line drawn between pleasure and pain. The real tension sitting underneath most compulsive, repetitive behavior is not reward against pain. It is reward against escape. And those two systems, it turns out, behave quite differently once you look closely at the underlying research. Start with what relief actually is mechanically, because it is easy to talk about relief loosely as a vague feeling of things being okay again, without appreciating that it has a specific signature in how the brain learns. When a person expects something threatening or unpleasant to happen and it does not happen, the brain registers that non occurrence as a kind of surprise, and that surprise generates a burst of positive signal. Researchers studying this have found that a specific population of dopamine neurons located in a midbrain structure called the ventral tegmental area fire specifically at the moment an expected aversive outcome fails to occur. This is not a minor detail. It means the brain treats the omission of something bad as its own distinct rewarding event, chemically similar in some respects to the reward signal generated when something good actually happens. This dopamine signal, triggered by the unexpected absence of threat, is necessary for a process called extinction learning, meaning it is part of what allows an organism to gradually update its expectations and learn that a previously feared situation is, in fact, safe. Under normal healthy conditions, this relief signal is not static. It behaves like what researchers call a prediction error, meaning its size depends on how surprising the safe outcome actually was. The first few times a feared situation turns out fine, the relief is strong because the brain genuinely did not expect that outcome. But as safety becomes more predictable, as the person accumulates repeated experience of the threat failing to materialize, the relief signal should naturally shrink because the outcome is no longer surprising. This declining pattern is actually the healthy version of the system working correctly. It means safety learning is happening. The brain is updating its models, treating the situation as genuinely less dangerous over time, and the emotional intensity of relief fades in step with that updated understanding, in much the same way fear itself is supposed to fade once a threat is repeatedly shown to be absent. The trouble begins when this decline does not happen the way it is supposed to, and this is where a fairly precise body of research on anxiety disorders becomes genuinely illuminating. In people with elevated anxiety, and especially in those who show low distress tolerance or a strong intolerance of uncertainty, this natural decline in relief intensity often fails to occur. Instead of shrinking as safety becomes predictable, the relief signal stays elevated across repeated experiences, remaining almost as strong on the 50th safe outcome as it was on the first. Researchers studying anxiety patients directly have found a specific, somewhat counterintuitive combination underlying this pattern. These individuals tend to engage in more avoidance behavior overall. They report weaker confidence that their avoidance behavior is actually what caused the safe outcome, and yet they simultaneously report stronger relief when the threat fails to materialize. That combination, more avoidance, less confidence that it works, but more relief when it seems to have worked anyway, is the signature of what researchers call impaired action safety learning. The brain is not properly updating its belief that the situation itself is safe. Instead, it is treating each threat omission as a fresh, ongoing surprise and continuing to deliver a strong relief signal every time, which keeps reinforcing the avoidance behavior itself without ever building the underlying safety knowledge that would normally cause the whole cycle to wind down. This matters enormously for understanding why avoidance behaviors can become so remarkably resistant to change even when the person doing them can articulate quite clearly that the behavior probably is not necessary anymore. There is a specific error embedded in how this feedback loop operates, and it has to do with what the brain credits for the good outcome. When a person performs a safety behavior, whether that is checking something repeatedly, avoiding a feared location, or engaging in a compulsive ritual, and the feared outcome then fails to occur, the brain tends to attribute that non occurrence specifically to the behavior itself rather than to the underlying safety of the situation. In other words, the person's mind concludes something like, nothing bad happened because I checked, rather than nothing bad happened because there was never really any danger there in the first place. This distinction sounds subtle, but it has enormous consequences because it means the person never actually gets to test directly whether the situation would have been fine anyway without the behavior. The safety behavior essentially absorbs all the credit, and in doing so, it prevents exactly the kind of disconfirming experience that would be needed to genuinely revise the original fear. Laboratory research on this mechanism has demonstrated it with striking clarity. In controlled conditioning experiments, participants who were given the option to perform an avoidance response during a phase designed to extinguish their fear continued to show strong physiological fear responses and intact expectations that the threat was still present, essentially unchanged from before the extinction phase began. Participants who went through the identical extinction phase without having an avoidance option available showed the normal pattern, with fear declining as expected. The mere presence of an available avoidance response was enough to block the learning that would otherwise have occurred. And in a further demonstration of just how fragile this protective effect is to reverse, researchers have found that even after a fear response has been successfully extinguished through proper exposure, simply reintroducing the option to avoid again without the person ever actually using it is sufficient to cause the fear to return. The mind treats the mere availability of an escape route as informative, apparently concluding that if an escape option has been provided, there must be something worth escaping from. At this point, it is worth naming the distinction directly because the terminology matters for understanding everything else in this episode. Reward, in the classical sense, studied in most addiction and motivation research, involves something genuinely pleasant happening, a stimulus with positive value that the brain wants to pursue and repeat. Escape, or negative reinforcement, works through an entirely different logic. It involves the removal or avoidance of something aversive, and the behavior gets reinforced not because anything pleasant occurred, but because something unpleasant was prevented or made to stop. These two processes can produce genuinely similar looking behavior from the outside: repetition, apparent motivation, difficulty stopping, but they are running on different underlying logic, and treating them as interchangeable tends to produce a shallow understanding of why certain behaviors are so hard to give up, even when the person deriving no pleasure from them insists, honestly, that they do not even like doing it anymore. This distinction becomes especially clear in research on a phenomenon called contrast avoidance, which offers one of the more counterintuitive findings in this entire body of literature. Researchers studying generalized anxiety and obsessive compulsive patterns have found that certain repetitive behaviors, including worry itself and compulsions like checking or washing, are sometimes maintained even when they do not actually reduce distress in any measurable way in the moment. What appears to reinforce the behavior instead is something closer to a narrative the person holds about what the behavior prevented, specifically the belief that without the behavior, a much sharper, more sudden spike of negative emotion would have occurred. Ecological studies tracking people with obsessive compulsive patterns in their actual daily lives have found that compulsions continue to be reinforced across time, even on occasions when anxiety does not measurably drop afterward, because avoiding that feared sharp contrast, the jump from calm to sudden dread, functions as its own reward, independent of whether the behavior produced any real reduction in present moment distress. This same logic extends to worry itself in generalized anxiety, where sustained, low grade negative emotion appears to be maintained on purpose, in a sense, as a way of preventing the sharper contrast that would occur if something went wrong while the person felt calm and unprepared. People with these patterns, when asked directly, sometimes describe this quite explicitly, reporting that they deliberately worry or ruminate in advance specifically so they will not be caught off guard by a worse feeling later, and in some cases, so that a better than expected outcome will feel like a pleasant surprise rather than simply neutral. This contrast avoidance framework helps explain something that otherwise looks paradoxical, which is why some of the most persistent, hardest to shift compulsive patterns are not actually being reinforced by pleasure or even by straightforward relief in the moment. They are being reinforced by an internal story about a worse alternative that never gets tested, because the whole point of the behavior is to prevent that alternative from ever coming into contact with reality. The behavior protects its own justification. As long as the compulsion or the worry continues, the person never actually finds out what would have happened without it, and that untested alternative remains available to serve as the imagined threat the behavior is credited with preventing. There is a further transformation that tends to happen to these behaviors over time, and it involves a shift away from being driven by goals and beliefs at all, toward becoming something closer to an automatic habit, triggered directly by cues rather than by any ongoing evaluation of whether the behavior is still useful. Researchers studying this transition have found, in both animal models and in clinical populations with obsessive compulsive patterns, a specific and somewhat unsettling pattern. Early in the development of an avoidance behavior, the response tends to remain sensitive to changes in its actual value, meaning if researchers can demonstrate to the animal or the person that the outcome the behavior was meant to prevent no longer matters, the behavior decreases accordingly, which is the signature of what is called goal-directed control. But after extended repetition, this sensitivity is lost. The behavior continues to occur even after the outcome it was originally meant to prevent has been explicitly devalued or shown to be irrelevant, which is the signature of habitual control instead. People with obsessive compulsive patterns show exactly this profile in careful testing. They can learn a task normally and use feedback appropriately in other contexts, and yet they continue performing compulsive actions even after being shown and apparently understanding that the outcome those actions were meant to prevent no longer applies. Confidence in the behavior's usefulness and actual performance of the behavior become disconnected from each other, with the behavior persisting on something closer to autopilot, triggered by the presence of a cue rather than by any live calculation of whether it is currently worth doing. This same relief based reinforcement logic extends well beyond anxiety disorders and compulsions narrowly defined, showing up across a surprisingly wide range of behaviors that on the surface look quite different from one another. In substance use research, there is a well established distinction between what is sometimes called reward craving, meaning wanting a substance for the positive, euphoric effect it produces, and relief craving, meaning wanting a substance specifically to end an already unpleasant state, such as withdrawal symptoms or negative mood. As substance use disorders progress in severity, researchers have found that this balance tends to shift, with negative reinforcement, meaning relief based motivation, increasingly dominating over positive, reward based motivation. People with more severe patterns of use are more often using the substance not to feel good in any straightforward sense, but specifically to stop feeling bad, which is a meaningfully different relationship to the substance than the one implied by a simple story about chasing pleasure. This same relief based structure shows up in research on compulsive buying behavior, where the anticipated relief associated with purchasing appears to persist and continue driving the behavior, even as the actual satisfaction people report from their purchases measurably declines over time, suggesting that the expectation of relief can become somewhat detached from whether relief is genuinely still being delivered. There is also a broader, more everyday version of this same principle that shows up in research on basic self regulation, worth mentioning because it helps explain why relief seeking behavior can override even a person's own explicit goals and intentions. Research on emotional distress and self control has found that when people are in a state of genuine emotional distress, they tend to prioritize immediate relief from that distress over almost every other competing goal, including goals related to long term self control or discipline that the same person in a calmer moment would say matter to them a great deal. This has sometimes been summarized in the research literature with the phrase, if you feel bad, do it, capturing the idea that acute emotional distress narrows a person's decision making toward whatever will make the feeling stop right now, often at the expense of considerations that would normally carry real weight. This is not a character flaw in any simple sense. It reflects something structural about how distress interacts with cognitive resources. Processing information carefully, weighing long term consequences, and exercising deliberate self control all require cognitive resources that appear to become less available precisely when distress is high, which means the pull toward immediate relief becomes strongest exactly when a person is least equipped to evaluate whether that relief seeking behavior is actually a good idea. It is worth pausing here to note that relief based reinforcement is not, in itself, some kind of design flaw or malfunction. In its normal, healthy form, it is doing genuinely important adaptive work. Learning quickly that a previously dangerous situation has become safe and updating behavior accordingly is a valuable capacity, and the same neural machinery that can become distorted into pathological avoidance is, under ordinary circumstances, exactly what allows fear to appropriately fade once real danger has passed. The problem is not that relief reinforces behavior. The problem is specifically what happens when the mechanisms that are supposed to update and eventually reduce that reinforcement as genuine safety becomes established fail to do their job, leaving relief locked in an elevated, sustained state that keeps rewarding a behavior long after any reasonable case could be made that the behavior is still necessary. Two further findings from the contrast avoidance research deserve mention because they add real texture to how stubbornly these patterns can persist, even under conditions that should, in theory, weaken them. The first involves a principle familiar from basic learning research more broadly that intermittent reinforcement, meaning a reward that arrives only some of the time rather than every time, tends to produce behavior that is more resistant to stopping than reinforcement that arrives consistently and predictably. Ecological studies of compulsions in daily life have found exactly this pattern, with compulsive behaviors persisting more vigorously, specifically when the sense of anxiety reduction they produce is inconsistent, arriving only some of the time, rather than reliably every time the behavior is performed. This is somewhat counterintuitive if you assume a behavior would only be strengthened by consistent success, but it fits a broader pattern seen across many species and many kinds of learned behavior, where unpredictable reward schedules tend to be, unusually good at sustaining a behavior over the long run. The second finding involves thought suppression specifically, the deliberate attempt to push an unwanted thought out of conscious awareness, which turns out to follow a similarly delayed and somewhat paradoxical pattern. Research tracking people's mood and intrusive thoughts in the moments and hours following an episode of deliberate thought suppression found that the suppression itself tends to worsen mood and increase the frequency of the unwanted thought in the short term, exactly the opposite of what the person doing the suppressing was hoping for. And yet, measured a couple of hours later, that same suppression episode was associated with improved mood and fewer obsessions, producing a delayed reinforcement effect that would be very difficult for a person to notice or accurately attribute in the moment, since the immediate experience of suppression is unpleasant, while the reinforcing payoff arrives much later and under different circumstances. It is worth adding one further caveat here because more recent research complicates the picture of relief as a straightforwardly sustained, pleasant state. Some newer work tracking physiological arousal during extended avoidance training has found that defensive, threat related bodily responses can reemerge quite quickly, even while a safety behavior is still technically in place, suggesting that at least some of what sustains repeated avoidance may not be one long, continuously pleasant relief signal, but a shorter burst of relief followed by a renewed sense of doubt, prompting the behavior to be repeated again in an attempt to resecure a feeling of safety that keeps slipping. There is also a genuinely interesting, more social version of the same underlying principle, one that extends the relief based reward system into an entirely different domain: interpersonal connection. Research on emotional communication has found that being understood by another person, having someone accurately recognize and validate an emotional state, appears to directly calm a threat related response in the body in a way that operates somewhat separately from actual problem solving. This helps explain a pattern many people have noticed: that receiving genuine empathy and validation from someone else can feel more immediately soothing than receiving well intentioned advice, even when the advice is objectively sound. Researchers studying interpersonal emotion regulation have found that people in daily life more often seek out this kind of emotional validation from others than they seek concrete problem solving help, even though the people around them tend to default to offering solutions and suggestions more readily than they offer simple acknowledgement. There is a physiological account for why validation works this way, involving what researchers call interpersonal neural synchrony, a measurable alignment in brain activity that occurs between two people during genuine emotional connection, and which appears to allow one person's regulated nervous system to help calm another's dysregulated one directly, essentially borrowing stability from another person's more settled internal state. This synchrony develops early, visible even between infants and caregivers, and appears to remain a core mechanism of emotional co regulation throughout life. What this adds to the broader picture is a reminder that relief is not only sought through solitary avoidance behaviors, compulsions, or substances. Connection itself functions as a genuine relief mechanism, and the same underlying principle that distress reliably seeks relief above almost any other competing priority likely helps explain why social connection can feel so urgently necessary during difficult periods, independent of whether anyone involved actually solves the underlying problem. There is a further wrinkle in how this pathological pattern tends to spread once it takes hold, and it involves something researchers call generalization. Under normal conditions, an avoidance response stays fairly specific to the particular situation or cue that originally seemed dangerous. But in people showing the sustained, non declining relief pattern already described, this specificity tends to break down. The relief and the avoidance response start extending outward to situations that resemble the original feared cue only loosely, or that carry no real objective danger at all. Someone who begins by avoiding one particular anxiety provoking scenario can find over time that the avoidance response has spread to a widening circle of related but genuinely safe situations, with the relief mechanism apparently unable to distinguish reliably between the original source of threat and its increasingly distant relatives. Intolerance of uncertainty appears to play a specific role in this spreading pattern, since people who struggle more with not knowing what will happen tend to show weaker discrimination between genuinely threatening and genuinely safe cues, especially when the underlying rules of a situation are unstable or unpredictable, which describes a great deal of ordinary life. The practical result is that a single seed of unresolved, pathologically reinforced avoidance can quietly expand its territory over months or years, without the person necessarily noticing the boundary of what they are avoiding creeping steadily outward. The neural underpinnings of why avoidance so effectively blocks the safety learning that would normally shrink it have been traced down to a fairly specific level of detail in animal research, which is worth mentioning because it grounds this entire discussion in something more concrete than behavioral description alone. Successful extinction of an avoidance response appears to depend on intact signaling through the endocannabinoid system, specifically within the hippocampus, a brain structure central to learning and memory more broadly. And researchers have found that boosting activity in this particular signaling pathway can facilitate safety learning and reduce the likelihood of a fear response returning later. Separately, work using a mouse model bred to display compulsive, obsessive like behavior identified a specific population of cells within the amygdala, a brain region central to processing threat and fear, whose heightened activity appeared to actively impair the animal's ability to extinguish an avoidance response. When researchers used a precise technique to quiet the activity of these specific cells, the animal's capacity to properly extinguish their avoidance behavior was restored. Findings like these matter because they show that the abstract behavioral pattern of blocked safety learning described throughout this episode is not merely a useful metaphor. It corresponds to identifiable physical processes in specific brain circuits, which is part of why this entire framework has become genuinely influential in how modern treatment approaches for anxiety and compulsive disorders are designed. Given everything covered so far, it is worth being precise about where the boundary sits between healthy relief and the pathological version of the same system, because the distinction is not simply about whether relief occurs at all, since relief is a normal and necessary part of how threat and safety get learned. The distinction lies in whether the relief signal is doing the job it is supposed to do, gradually shrinking as genuine safety becomes established, and eventually allowing the underlying behavior to become unnecessary, or whether it has become detached from that updating process entirely, remaining elevated indefinitely, and continuing to reinforce a behavior that has stopped tracking any real current assessment of danger. Several specific markers distinguish these two states based on the research already discussed. In healthy relief, the intensity of the good feeling declines across repeated safe experiences, and confidence that a specific situation is actually safe increases correspondingly. In the pathological version, relief stays roughly constant across repetitions. Confidence in the actual safety of the situation may even decrease rather than increase, and the behavior begins triggering automatically from cues rather than from any active, ongoing evaluation of whether it remains necessary. In healthy relief, removing the option to perform the safety behavior does not particularly matter, because the person has genuinely learned the situation itself is safe. In the pathological version, removing that option, or even the anticipation that it might be removed, can trigger a resurgence of fear, because the person's sense of safety was never really located in the situation to begin with. It was located entirely in the behavior This has direct implications for why certain therapeutic approaches to anxiety and compulsive behavior are structured the way they are, though it is worth understanding the underlying mechanism before jumping to any particular technique. Exposure based approaches to treating anxiety disorders are generally built around maximizing something researchers call expectancy violation, meaning deliberately creating situations where a person confronts a feared cue without performing their usual safety behavior, specifically so that the brain finally gets the disconfirming experience it has been prevented from having. When a person faces a feared situation without the avoidance response available, and the feared outcome still fails to occur, the resulting surprise generates exactly the kind of prediction error signal described earlier in this episode. The same dopaminergic burst tied to unexpected safety, and this time because no safety behavior is available to absorb the credit. That signal has a chance to genuinely update the person's underlying belief about the situation itself, rather than reinforcing yet another round of avoidance. This is precisely why simply removing access to a compulsion or an avoidance behavior, uncomfortable as that process often is, tends to be more effective for genuinely revising an overblown threat belief than continuing to perform the behavior while gradually trying to feel differently about it. The behavior itself is what has been standing in the way of the very learning that would make it unnecessary. This same relief based logic extends into clinical territory that, on the surface, has little obvious connection to anxiety or compulsive checking. Researchers working with chronic pain patients have described a closely related pattern, sometimes called the fear avoidance model, in which a person who has experienced pain begins avoiding movement or activity out of fear that the movement will cause further injury or pain. In the short term, this avoidance genuinely does prevent the feared pain experience, delivering exactly the kind of relief signal described throughout this episode. But over the longer term, the avoidance itself often contributes to physical deconditioning, increased disability, and sometimes even heightened pain sensitivity, precisely because the person never gets the chance to learn through actual movement that many of the activities they are avoiding would not have caused the harm they fear. The behavior protects its own premise in exactly the same way avoidance does in anxiety disorders, preventing the disconfirming experience that would otherwise update the underlying belief. A related pattern appears in some eating disorder research where specific fears around particular foods, body sensations, or the physical experience of fullness are avoided through restriction or other compensatory behaviors, again delivering short term relief from anxiety while blocking the kind of direct, repeated exposure that might otherwise weaken the fear over time. One further, somewhat unusual example is worth including because it shows how far this relief seeking pattern can extend beyond anything resembling a deliberate, consciously chosen behavior. Researchers studying a phenomenon called maladaptive daydreaming, in which people engage in extensive, vivid, immersive fantasy that intrudes on daily functioning, have found that this pattern tends to occur together with obsessive compulsive symptoms in a way that suggests a similar underlying cycle. In some of this research, obsessive compulsive symptoms specifically were found to reliably precede episodes of daydreaming, suggesting that the elaborate fantasy itself may be functioning as a kind of relief seeking behavior, offering escape from an uncomfortable, obsessive internal state in a manner structurally similar to compulsive checking or washing, even though the surface behavior looks completely different. This is a useful reminder that the specific form a relief seeking behavior takes, whether it involves a physical ritual, a mental compulsion, a substance, or an elaborate internal fantasy world, may matter far less than the underlying function the behavior is serving, which throughout all of these examples remains remarkably consistent: the termination or the felt termination of an unwanted internal state. It is also worth being honest about where this framework still has genuine open questions, because the research is not entirely settled on every point, particularly when it comes to how cleanly this habit versus goal directed distinction applies to something as complex as substance addiction. Some researchers studying addiction argue that persistence in drug seeking, especially in its more severe forms, is better explained by excessive goal directed valuation of the drug under conditions of negative affect, rather than by a simple transition into pure habit detached from any goal at all. There is also evidence that experimentally inducing genuine habits in humans, purely through repetition in laboratory settings, tends to be surprisingly weak and difficult to achieve, which has led some researchers to argue that many of the clinical patterns that get labeled as habitual are better understood as a specific kind of impaired goal directed control rather than a wholesale takeover by a separate mindless habit system. This is a genuinely unresolved area, and a fair account of the evidence should include that the field has not fully agreed on exactly how much of compulsive, relief seeking behavior reflects true habit, in the strict technical sense used in this research, versus a more subtle distortion of ongoing, goal directed decision making that merely looks habitual from the outside. What all of this adds up to is a genuinely different way of understanding why certain behaviors can grip a person so tightly despite producing little or no actual enjoyment. The old story, built around chasing pleasure, only explains part of human motivation and arguably not the most tenacious part. The relief based story explains something the pleasure story cannot: why a person can perform a behavior they openly dislike, gain no evident joy from, and still find almost impossible to stop because the behavior was never being reinforced by how good it felt. It was being reinforced by how effectively or how convincingly it made something bad seem to disappear. Distress, it turns out, does not need a reward waiting on the other side of a behavior in order to keep that behavior alive. It only needs the behavior to seem, even inaccurately, like the reason the distress went away, and once that belief takes hold, the behavior can continue running on its own logic, disconnected from pleasure, disconnected sometimes even from genuine present moment relief, sustained instead by an untested story about the worst thing it is quietly assumed to be preventing. That is Strides to Solutions for this episode. Thank you for listening.